Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am very, very happy to have you here. I'm your political host, Will Wright. I'm joined by my ever faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing great. Thanks, Will.
And today we have with us David Daley. Excuse me, my voice is a little hoarse or something. So we have David Daley with us today. He's a senior fellow at Fair Vote and the author of two acclaimed books on American democracy. One is called Ratf. KED. I'll have to ask you what that means. While you're voting,
Pastor Josh.
Yes, it's a book that helped actually spark the movement to end partisan gerrymandering and Unrigged.
A lot of good that did, huh?
Yeah, a lot of good that did, right? His other book chronicles state efforts to protect voting rights, and he's appeared in all kinds of news and media outlets like the New Yorker, New York Times, Atlantic, and has done a whole bunch of other really, really impressive stuff. But we're just going to ask him to explain himself. Like, you've got this wide career in journalism. Like, what was it about, election reform and gerrymandering that made you want to make this your life's work?
Yeah, it's amazing, right? I never would have imagined that in a lot of ways. But once you begin to look at American politics through the lens of redistricting, it's awfully hard to stop. It opens your eyes to just how important these otherwise invisible lines are in determining who represents us and how they behave once they're in office. It all started for me when I was editor of Salon. I was running our politics team. It was not long after the 2012 election. We were looking at really just, I wasn't new to politics, but the dysfunction that followed that election, 50-something votes to repeal Obamacare when you probably could have done one or two. I had grown up in Connecticut. We had just had our first son, and Sandy Hook happened, and certainly the politics of gun control are very complicated in this country. But boy, I thought if anything was going to lead to some kind of sensible dialogue or conversation, it might be that. And when it didn't happen, one question I started asking was, well, why didn't Democrats take back the Congress, take back the House in 2012 when Obama's reelected? Democrats gained seats in the U.S. Senate, but it wasn't even close in the House. Republicans held a 234-201 edge. And I looked at some of the states, Pennsylvania, which goes for Obama, but elects 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats. Ohio goes for Obama, but it's 12-4. Michigan, and it's 9-5. Virginia, and it's 8-3. North Carolina, and it's 9-4 in the House. And I said, well, how did that happen? And what I came across was a really fascinating Republican political strategy called Redmap, short for the Redistricting Majority Project. And the goal was to plot a path back to power through state legislatures, because state legislatures draw congressional lines after the census. And if you can win control of state legislatures, oftentimes inexpensive, quiet races, no one realizes oftentimes that they have these bigger roles to play. And Republicans quite brilliantly recognized this, won those races, remapped the nation. And I don't think you can really understand the politics of our country since then without grappling with how that happened and how it's worked.
Wow. So I just need to make sure I'm wrapping my mind around all this. Actually, one of the things that I had never even thought about gerrymandering. I mean, I had heard of it, and I'm like, oh, that sounds weird. Like, it just sounds like cheating, like on both sides, right? It just sounds like, hey, let's cheat, and then kind of both sides cheat. But what I hear you saying is that there was at least a concentration in the Republican. They kind of were the catalyst behind this idea, and I'll give you a chance to correct me if I'm saying anything wrong. But I guess what I'm trying to think of, like even getting back to the basics of this, because I think this is so crucial to understand the argument that you're making. And I think if we don't really get gerrymandering, we're not going to understand everything else you're saying. I think it'll be, an idea I would love for you to really describe and help us understand, help me and our audience understand, what is gerrymandering and why is it so bad? Like, why is it an issue if it seems like both sides are doing it? Maybe they're not. Help me understand. Go ahead, please.
Sure. Big question. There's a lot there. Let me unpack it best I can. And if I miss something, I'll walk back through it.
You'll be totally okay.
We've had gerrymandering as long as we've had politicians. You can trace it back to Patrick Henry trying to keep James Madison out of our very first Congress. It takes its name from Elbridge Gerry with a hard G. He's the governor of Massachusetts in 1812 when his party, the Democratic Republicans, tried to draw state Senate lines around Boston to keep the hated Federalists out of power.
Nice.
A political cartoonist takes a look at these districts, thinks that they look like a snake or a salamander, and it is called the gerrymander in his infamous honor. So
I love that.
There are no redistricting angels. For a long time, so district lines, however, have to be drawn anytime you have a system that uses single member districts, right? As the U.S. House does, as all state legislatures do. The courts have said that these districts essentially have to be equal in population. So every 10 years after the census, there's a population shift, right? States gain and lose seats, states' populations change. And so districting and redistricting really is the job of trying to equalize population. It starts out of fairness. Gerrymandering comes into play when politicians take advantage of the process when they have control over it and draw district lines that advantage their party and disadvantage the other side. The two main tools of this are called cracking and packing. So if you are team blue and you are trying to gerrymander the Republicans out of power, what you might do is draw one district in your state that the Republicans win overwhelmingly. Maybe they'll take 90% of the vote there. What does that mean? It means that there are fewer Republicans in all the other seats, right? So you can scatter them, you can crack them across all of those other districts, and you can win more seats, sometimes even with fewer votes, if you mathematically arrange the other side's seats into a handful of places. If you essentially distribute the other side's voters as inefficiently as possible and spread yours out as efficiently as possible, you can control delegations, even 50-50 delegations with fewer votes. You know, sometimes I take Legos and I'll take 10 red Legos and 10 blue Legos, and you can take the same number of Legos and I can create 3 blue or 3 red districts really, really easily, just based on how I stack them up. So the modern story of redistricting also intersects with the modern story of technology and how technology has gotten so much better and stronger. Nobody's using Legos anymore. They are using highly sophisticated computer software. They're uploading massive terabytes of voter information, public and private data sets, census data that allows these map makers to go up and down streets and essentially create districts where the winners for a decade have been predetermined. Republicans realized this first in modern times. So the way I would explain the story is it starts in 2008 with a big Barack Obama victory. Democrats win a super majority in the U.S. Senate. You've got the smartest minds on the Republican and the Democratic side saying, boy, the Democrats have assembled a coalition here that could be the defining majority coalition in American politics for decades to come. And it didn't exactly work out that way, right? And one key reason why is because Republicans looking for a path back to power understood that while the 2008 election was historic, the 2010 election could be more consequential. It followed a census year. And there were a handful of really smart Republican strategists who said, well, if we can win control of state legislatures in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Florida, Indiana, Wisconsin, Alabama, we could have complete power over drawing those district lines with this new technology the following year. They targeted about 115 state legislative races across 17 states. They won this control in all 17 of those states, and they remapped the entire country really in their advantage. So it's not that Democrats don't gerrymander. They certainly still do. It's that Republicans control more states. They have more opportunity to do this, and they control more strategic states because they control still, in many cases, these purplish swing states like North Carolina, like Ohio, until recently, Wisconsin, and have been able to do this in places where there's lots and lots of seats.
So just two quick things, just to make sure that I understand. So they basically, if they can get the state, now are you talking about the state legislature, like not federal?
Yeah,
it's you're talking about the local Senate,
state legislatures.
Okay, and so they have the power to redistrict?
In most states, it's the state legislatures that have the power to draw lines, usually in conjunction with the governor. And so it is, a map is like any other state law. It is created by the state legislators and by the governor. And so if you can control that, it's like this loophole in our politics. It's Moneyball, if you're familiar with the baseball book about the Oakland A's. Excuse me. It's trying to find that loophole that no one else is paying attention to that has outsized importance, and fully taking advantage of it.
In Texas, they just voted to do their whole map thing. Mm-hmm. California is in the process. Like, what's the difference between, what they're doing in Texas and then what they're doing in California?
Both of it really bad. What they're doing in Texas, at the behest of President Trump, is they are drawing a map that's going to add 5 Republican districts. California, in retaliation, is looking to suspend its independent commission, and they've drawn a map that is going to add 5 Democratic districts. The Princeton Gerrymandering Project has looked at this. They say that these 2 maps are the 2 best examples, the 2 worst examples. They are the most manipulated electoral boundaries that this country has seen since the 1970s, when you can start measuring this stuff. Really, really anti-voter maps. It was going to create a 48-4 Democratic delegation from California, and probably Texas had been 25-13, so that will go to 30-8. So it's going to really do a job on swing districts. If you are a Republican in California or an independent in California, you are not going to have an awful lot of say. Same if you were in Texas. The backdrop for all this, of course, is that only 3 seats separate the 2 parties in Congress right now. And so every single seat takes on outsized importance as we head towards a midterm election. The midterms tend to favor the party that's out of power, that they usually gain somewhere between 12 and 20 seats in Congress. And when you only have a 3-seat edge, that's a little scary. So, Republicans are looking to effectively add on to that advantage before a single vote has been cast.
I'm curious on 2 things. One, what's the metric by which, both Republicans and Democrat, if to choose the district? I thought I read or heard somewhere that for at least the Republicans, it's districts that Trump won at least 60% of the vote or something like that. My numbers might be off. So first, yeah, what's the metric to choose the districts to change? And then two, like, what are the possible shortfalls or what are the things that could go wrong by redistricting?
Yeah, they use all kinds of different voter metrics, and the amazing thing about these software programs is that you can do, hundreds and sometimes even thousands of maps and really work and perfect them. But essentially what you're doing is you're building an index off of previous elections and how those elections went precinct by precinct. And you might imagine elections that went well for your party, but also build in elections that did not go as well for your party. So certainly, if you're a Republican in Texas, and you're building these maps only off of what happened in 2024, which was a really good year for them, and they saw big gains, for example, among Latino voters. If you lose those gains, you could have faulty assumptions going into your map, right? That's why they're always testing these against multiple different indices. So you might also use 2018 and 2020, which were years that were a little bit closer in the state. And you want to build yourself margins that are not so close that a wave tips them the other way. So the sweet spot really is you're trying to draw, if you're the Republicans in Texas, a whole bunch of 58% to 62% districts. Because if you're going to lose those seats, the kind of wave that would be required would be an 8 to 10 point wave. And, Texas hasn't seen a Democratic +8 year. I mean, you'd have to go back decades. The best year Democrats have had in the state of Texas in the last, in the 21st century would be 2018 when it was R +3. So to imagine a D +8, pretty tricky. And those 58 to 62% seats are probably pretty good. Right now, Republicans in Texas have got a whole bunch of 60 plus and 65 plus seats. So what they can do is they can spread those votes around a little more efficiently by remapping. They can go after those 2 districts in South Texas. You can take some of those districts, say in Houston. And essentially what you're trying to do there is you're cracking those. So if there's a lot of Democratic voters in one place, one option is to draw sort of, I like to explain it as like a pizza slice. You put the blue city in the center of the pizza, and then you carve up diagonal slices in such a way that there's just a little bit of blue at the tip of all of these districts at the front of the slice, but the actual voters, it's mostly redder Central Texas attached onto that. And they've been really good at doing that, for example, in Austin in the past, or a city like Salt Lake City right now, right, in which it's a blue enclave in the middle of a red state. So you just divide it in quarters. You put a quarter of it into each district. You attach it to, redder parts of the state. And you have created a 4-row map. And so there's lots of ways that this can be done, right? Democrats in Illinois are doing it differently, right? They're trying to take, enough of Chicago and attach it in spaghetti slices, right? Down into other parts of the state. So there's lots of different ways of doing this, depending on which side you are trying to advantage.
Man, it really feels like this should be outlawed.
Yes, it should.
It really feels like this is like completely like not. It's not at all what you think of a fair voting system. So here's what I mean. I go and I vote, and I figure my vote's going to make a difference, right? I'm voting, and I know I'm one amongst millions, but I'm going and I'm sending it in, And I figure it makes a difference. Well, when you look at this, you're like, oh, wait, it doesn't make a difference. It just determines where they categorize me if I happen to be a part of a larger conglomeration of equal voters, of like ilk in my voting. And it's really disturbing. And so I would love to give you a chance just to say anything else you'd like, because I want to ask a question about mail-in voting, but I wanted to give a chance to kind of, if there's anything else, like from what I said just now about gerrymandering, if you wanted to respond to that, go ahead before I ask the other question.
You're absolutely right. I mean, in 2024, there were 37 districts out of 435 that were within 5 percentage points. So that's about 8% of all congressional elections in this country that were actually competitive. All of the rest were essentially predetermined. And they were predetermined by, Wyoming is going to go red and Massachusetts is going to go blue. But there's a whole bunch of districts that were predetermined by how those district lines were drawn. Map makers and politicians picked who represents those districts, not voters. And they decided it for a decade before voters even got to the polls. And that is wrong. And when you have non-competitive districts, what it does is it pushes all of the energy, all of the import goes into the primary. And primaries tend to be low turnout, base-driven affairs. Sometimes over the summer, no one even knows the election's taking place. Sometimes because those elections are important, you might have 10, 11 people running in them. And so the winner might come out with a quarter of the vote. You've got a fraction of a fraction choosing everybody's representative. And when those people go to Washington or to state capitals, they're not looking to serve everybody. They're looking to serve they're accountable to the sliver of the primary electorate that put them in office and who can take them out of office. And so when so many of us think that our politicians aren't listening to us or delivering for us or don't care what we think, we're not wrong. They don't.
We're not wrong.
I mean, under this system, they are not accountable to us and they are oftentimes insulated from the ballot box. And so, I think what we really need to be looking at is a more proportional system that, larger multi-member districts that would take the power away from map makers and politicians and really put it back in the hands of voters again. I've never voted in a competitive congressional election in my life. I'm 54 years old and I've lived all over the country. I would love to vote in a competitive swing race. It doesn't. There's not very many of us lucky enough to.
Yeah. That makes. I don't want to say that makes sense because it doesn't make sense, but I understand what you're saying. It is what's the reality. So I would love to talk about and ask you about Trump's. He posted in August that he'd issue another executive order or an executive order for nationwide voter ID, paper ballot use, and no mail-in voting. That he essentially would speak on that and trying to ban mail-in voting. And I want to kind of concentrate on that. What is going on here? Is he actually banning this? Do you think this is going to be able to happen? And what's the logic behind this, do you think?
I don't think this is actually going to happen. The president can't do that via executive order. The Constitution gives this power to Congress. And Congress would have to change this. Essentially, this power is with each individual state to regulate how its own elections are conducted. And there are numbers of states, both red, blue, and purple, that have decided to use mail-in balloting for lots and lots of reasons. It's more convenient, it's cheaper, it's very safe. It allows some of these far-flung states, places like Utah and Oregon, or Arizona, where much of the population is rural, and otherwise hours away from a precinct to be able to vote with ease. So this is fairly common all over the place, and Congress would have to step in and do a nationwide ban if they wanted to. I don't think they would want to. I imagine lots of Republicans would be opposed to this, and I certainly don't think you could get to a filibuster-proof 60. So I don't think that this is, certainly anytime the president talks like this, we have to take it seriously. But I don't think that the actual reality is that a mail-in ban is possible. It's not within the power of an executive order.
When we talk about mail-in voting and banning it, the first thing that came to mind was me and my family. We moved to Virginia from Washington State, and we never once voted in a booth or anything. We just had our ballot sent to us, and we loved it because we could spend time, talk about it, like hop on the internet, find out who these people are, and we felt we were doing ourselves, a service that way. So if you ban mail-in voting, like, who would actually be affected? I think you mentioned a couple of them a second ago, if you live far away from their precinct or whatever, but like who are these people that are mailing in their votes?
Yeah, well, there were 13 states and the District of Columbia that mail-in balloting accounted for 30% or more of all the ballots cast in 2024. And Donald Trump won half of those states. So this is not a partisan question. There are, lots of Democrats, lots of Republicans, lots of independents who take advantage of the opportunity to use a mail-in ballot. Some states have gone entirely a vote by mail. And the states that have done that, they often tend to be Western states where the population is so diffuse and so spread out that to set up precincts all over the state, would come at huge expense, and also a huge delay in collecting and reporting results. So it is been a question of efficiency. You simply get better, fairer, faster results from mail-in balloting than you do if you are sitting with a bunch of paper ballots trying to tabulate them all. It's a little known fact, but the error rate on paper ballots is actually much higher than it is as far as tabulation on a machine count. So I think, and I think the president might not get this, but I think lots of other Republicans do, which is that this is a service that lots and lots of voters use, and that to put an end to mail-in balloting, to require specific forms of ID, would in many ways be to suppress their own voters. The voters that have the most trouble with ID, specific forms of ID, are minority voters and the white working class. And as you see the white working class heading towards the Republican Party, those are the voters that would be really dramatically affected by this. And I think that the good news is that this isn't doable by executive order. But I think the bad news is that whenever we talk about election fraud or any of these topics without all the facts behind us, we drive up fear and we create apprehensions that are wrong, and it calls results into question. And I mean, I worry that sometimes that's the goal, is to drive up confusion and to sow doubts about results when there isn't actually any basis for that.
Yeah, that's a very concerning idea, isn't it? And it actually kind of connects with my question that I just have just kind of burning in my mind a little bit. And what I'm wondering is, so if I'm thinking about this like correctly, the people who are studying this, right, experts in the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, everything, they're aware of these issues that people have to vote, right? I mean, like I'm not trying to sound dumb, but I just want to make sure that, like, with the sophistication of the tools that they have, they're all aware. I guess my point is, right, like when they're pushing these things forward, and someone says, because I often hear like, well, what's wrong with an ID? That's just common sense. Or, like basically trying to justify what's happening by saying it's not a big deal. It's just common sense, like almost like making it, like making the other side feel stupid or like ignorant for even wondering about it. And yet we know that if they're creating these barriers for people, they know that's going to do, correct? I mean, how could they not know? I mean, is that a good intuition? Do you feel like that's a correct intuition?
It's simply fact. And there is some common sense behind voter ID, right? I have to pull my ID out of my wallet every time I want to buy a bottle of wine at the grocery store, which these days is pretty often. But not everybody has an ID. Right. And sometimes it's that white working class worker who is, following a factory job and hasn't had a passport and is showing up in a new state for work, and might have a driver's license, but the driver's license might not be enough to register because you might have to have other papers. But other times what states have done is that they've put together really specific forms of ID quite intentionally, knowing who has and who doesn't have them. Texas, for example, back in 2013, when they passed what was at the time one of the most restrictive voter ID bills in the country, when this went to court, it came out that the state of Texas had studied the forms of ID that Latino citizens in the state of Texas were least likely to have, required other ones, right? So they knew which forms people didn't have, and they were able to base their list on that. North Carolina, not long after that, they passed an ID bill that was modeled after Texas in many ways. And one of the things they did, it required a driver's license and other forms of ID. Republicans there, as they were drawing district lines, especially district lines around college towns, as you know, in North Carolina, where there's a lot of those, they created databases in which they matched up public college students, and they knew, they compared that to the driver's license databases. And they said, okay, which of these students do not have driver's licenses and won't be able to vote? And they drew district lines, most famously, that went right through the heart of North Carolina A&T, one of the historic Black universities in Greensboro. the line that went through the center of that campus was entirely by design, right? The state of Alabama, when they required an ID, what they did after that, they claimed it was budget cuts, but they closed all the driver's license offices in the Black Belt of Alabama. So you simply couldn't go and get the driver's license if you wanted it. So I don't have any problem necessarily. If we're going to give everybody an ID or accept reasonable ID, I don't have any problem with showing up and saying who I am. But if we're going to require specific forms, knowing that certain people don't have them, that to me is a pretty serious issue.
Agreed.
How do school districts like operate? Because when you are redrawn on these lines, and correct me if I'm wrong, like it also affects like where your kid goes to school, doesn't it?
Well, sure. There are map makers in the state of California, for example, some of these towns that might be white and also Latino, in which map makers are able to make a really good living drawing school district lines that keep certain schools white. So that's an art form in some of these states around the country. Absolutely. Once you realize, like I said at the top, once you realize the power of districting to draw lines that keep certain people in and certain people out, and you can say, well, that's just where the line is. It's never where the line is. It's where somebody placed the line. And the power to place that line is the power to decide who's on which side of it, who's in, who's out.
Well, what about some states, I believe, like California, Virginia, maybe had like a third-party commission help draw the lines. Like what's that all about? And is that kind of a net positive or doesn't really do much?
Yeah, that's been really one of the lead reforms that voters trying to take this power away from politicians and giving it back to people. So lots of states have passed independent commissions or bipartisan commissions, or tried to find various ways to put some guardrails on the system. And where you can put guardrails on the system, it tends to work better. You get fairer districts, you get more competitive districts, you get voters who are happier with their choices. The trouble, as we're seeing right now, as California is talking about suspending their commission, is that anytime you have all 50 states and who are building a national map together, when any one of those states does something bad, there's national consequences. So there becomes no incentive for the states that are doing it right to keep doing it right if Illinois and Florida and Maryland and Texas get to do it any way they want, which I think is one of the reasons why, in this case, we really need a national standard here if we're going to have fairness. Everybody's got to play by the same rules.
Yeah, I mean, that just seems like standard fairness in practice. But anyway, maybe that's my old fashioned nature coming out, when we're thinking about reform, because we hear a lot about reform, and of course, after the post 2020 election, with the amount of controversy that was spread around that election and it being stolen and all that, where do you imagine or think that if there is reform, which seems like there is, but we're going to disagree on where that comes from, not you and me necessarily, but, different people, where should reformers spend their energy? Where should people spend their energy to try to bring corrections in your way of viewing it?
I think we need a national solution to a national problem. Now, this isn't to say that if you live in Texas, if you live in California, if you live in Missouri right now, as this gerrymander is about to be underway there, you should be, active and involved and speaking up. Oftentimes there's the ability to give public testimony or, show up at rallies or the like, politicians think they can get away with this oftentimes because it usually happens in the dark, because it sounds obscure and weird and wonky. But when they see that people are paying attention, it becomes a little bit harder. Litigation in some of these states could provide a road towards fairness. We will see. The courts have become pretty partisan, red and blue alike. So that becomes a complicated path in some states. But I think where reformers ought to be thinking, is that this is a national problem. It needs a national solution. More and more Americans are aware of this. The 2026 election is going to be fought against a backdrop of partisan gerrymandering nationwide. This is the time for us to be having a real national conversation about what we might do to fix it. It can't get much worse than this. We're about to have pretty much a maximally gerrymandered map, right? We're talking about a race to the bottom. It's more like a sprint to the bottom. We're that close. So maybe once we reach it, there's time for us to all sort of step back, and people of good faith can come together and say, hey, how can we do this in a way that restores meaning and representation to our elections?
Mm-hmm. There are still people that believe the 2020 election was stolen. And I'd love for you to one, kind of opine on whether or not that is true or not, and help people kind of work through like the idea of the 2020 election was not stolen, and how can they find out for themselves.
Well, Republicans won an awful lot of elections in 2020. Were those races stolen too? Sometimes it feels as if the races we think are stolen are the races we lost. Plenty of states that went for Joe Biden in 2020 elected Republicans at lots and lots of different levels, and I guess I would suggest that no one's talking about those races being stolen, but there were something close to 6 lawsuits that were filed. They were heard by the courts, oftentimes by very conservative courts, and they were rejected by those courts. The 2020 election was free and fair, and when we don't like the results of an election, we used to call and congratulate the other side, and move on and try to think about maybe what our side had done wrong and might do different next time. Would that we could get back to that kind of, honest thinking again. The election was super close in some of those states. But it was not that close nationally, right? 7.5 million votes for Biden over Trump that year. Big turnout. Very close in Georgia, very close in Arizona, very close in Wisconsin. But free and fair. And when we don't like the results of an election, what we have to do is go out and work harder next time.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds reasonable to me. So I'm not really sure why we wouldn't do that, except that certain people want to keep power, right? Once you have it. Yeah, go ahead.
there's no proof of any voter fraud. I mean, this to me is the thing that we have to come back to, right? If someone's going to talk about voter fraud, I'd like to see the actual evidence, and
yes,
they're never able to produce it. So voter fraud has become sort of this boogeyman that justifies all of these laws that actually do make it harder for people to vote, but that aren't based in any reality. The Heritage Foundation keeps a database of voter fraud, and the Heritage Foundation's about as right as, I think tanks go. And there's a guy named Hans von Bukowski that has got this. It's his baby. And there's about 1,500, 1,600 examples dating back to the early 1980s. Now, lots of those examples are just mistakes in filling out absentee ballots. But this is the leading person calling for these laws. This is the leading foundation. And they're only able to come up with 1,500 or 1,600 examples out of the hundreds of billions of votes that have been cast over that time. We're not talking about anything that is really a serious issue. Dinesh D'Souza has been forced to back away from much of what's in his movie, right? The Fox News and Newsmax lawsuits against Dominion ended in billion-dollar, hundreds of millions of dollars of payouts. All of those lawsuits that were filed in 2020 were rejected by courts and judges across the political spectrum. I think if we're going to keep talking about fraud, there ought to be some onus on those who bring it up to, put up or shut up.
Yeah, I understand that sentiment completely. What do you imagine? We've been talking about this whole time, and what's going on with the elections, the voting, what should be next, what's happened. My question is, moving forward, what do you imagine are the biggest threats right now? I know we've kind of, again, probably mentioned them overlap, but where is this going, do you think? If it's maximally gerrymandered, what's next? What do you imagine?
Yeah, a maximally gerrymandered map is, when only 8% of congressional elections are competitive, and now we're about to knock competitive races in Texas and Ohio and California off the board, and who knows where else. We might be looking at, 20 that are actually competitive out of 435. That to me is pretty frightful. And the U.S. Supreme Court looking at another case in October that could narrow the Voting Rights Act further, that could do away with majority-minority seats across the South. I think we're not talking enough about the state of the Voting Rights Act in some states where it's very much still necessary, but has been really put through the shredder by this court. I worry that all of these executive orders are in fact designed to sort of sow doubt about the 2026 elections and the fairness of it, without, again, having any actual proof about it, but just to sort of create the sense that if the other side wins, that there has somehow been cheating or foul play, when that actually won't be able to be proven. I worry about troops. I worry about these, about deployment of National Guard to Democratic cities on election day. Especially if you are, imagine if you are able to end mail-in voting, and then what you have on election day are 6, 7, 8 hour lines in Atlanta, Milwaukee, Detroit, Philadelphia. And then you send the National Guard out, and then you have masked ICE agents on the street on election day, just intimidating voters. That would have sounded like something out of an apocalyptic movie just a few years ago, right? But as I say it now, it's sort of imaginable. I don't think we're describing. I don't think we're describing the crazy. I don't think you have to have Trump derangement syndrome or something to be looking at this and saying, "Boy, we're on some dangerous paths here." I hope that calmer heads can prevail and we can step aside from them.
Yeah, I do too. Man, David, thank you so much for being on the program with us today. I mean, it has been truly enlightening, and I just appreciate your insight. I appreciate, your view on it and your understanding of the material. Thank you so much for sharing your heart and mind with us.
Really a pleasure. I'm a fan, so it's an honor to be on with you all. So thank you so much for the ability to have this conversation.
Absolutely. Well, we're fans of you, and we're fans of voting, and we want voting to be fair here at Faithful Politics. I'll say it from the conservative side, dude. I'm a Republican. I'm going to vote for Republican, except for maybe the presidential election, and that's normally what I do. But I just we are a fan of voting here at Faithful Politics, and we appreciate your work, David, and trying to spread light and help people understand and do work to actually let's get back to something common sense here in America. And that's what we want. That's what we all want. Well, again, thank you so much. And to our viewers, guys, thanks for joining us. We're going to put all sorts of, you know what? I should ask this though, before I do this. David, how can people get involved and how can they connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. First. Fair Vote is fairvote.org. I am on Twitter. I'm Dave Daley 3. I'm Dave Daley on the Blue Sky. You can find the books wherever you find books. Your local bookstore is a pretty great place to go, but there's all kinds of places online if your local bookstore doesn't have it or isn't convenient. So just be really careful asking for the first book by name.
I love it, and we'll put that in the description so everyone can see it, and then they can try to go buy it and ask for it by name. David, again, thank you. Appreciate you, and to our viewers, guys, like, subscribe, do the stuff that hacks the algorithm. We love you. We appreciate you. We want to keep getting this stuff out to you, so keep your conversations not right or left, but up, and we'll see you next time.